Sit down. Let me tell you a story. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was released when I was 7 years old. It took the world by storm, turning children into bookworms and bestowing the magic of reading onto an entire generation. Not me, though. I didn't understand books. At age 7, I'd just gotten my PlayStation. I had no friends, I was fat, I was lonely, and video games were my solace and my comfort, not books. I always thought of books as movies without the music and the set design. And who wanted that? They were stories you couldn't interact with. In that way, I was naive to the power of my own imagination. If I didn't know what a character looked like through an illustration, an actor's voice, or a character's movements and behavior, how could I be entertained by them? I would overhear other kids talking about how funny this one page of a Roald Dahl book was, or how dumb Ron Weasley was, and I'd think to myself, how can silent voices be funny? There's no tone, no accent, no inflection. My parents didn't read either. They still don't. In fact, the only reading material we had in the house was the Daily Mail, the UK's most popular and toxic tabloid. In other words, I grew up in a bookless household. Sadly too, none of my teachers were bookish. In UK elementary schools, one teacher handles all the subjects, and a passion for books was completely lacking in every grade. On World Book Day, we'd be given tokens for a free book, and I'd honestly have no idea what to do with them. Let's fast forward to age 23. I'm a newly qualified high school English teacher, a former lazy teen turned bookaholic adult by way of a brief fling with acting and theatre. I was doing my best to convince angry and hormonal teenage boys that reading is great, how books can help you find solace and comfort, teach you empathy, expand your imagination. When one lad asked me how I got into reading, I had to pause. I thought to myself, do I tell him a lie? That I grew up devouring books? That when the other boys were outside playing football, I was curled up under a tree with a good book? No, I opted for the truth instead. I told him that I was a sad, lonely child who spent his days hidden away playing Final Fantasy IX, still my favourite game, on my PS1. The student laughed and asked me how I ended up as an English teacher. Well, I said, I had my own teacher to thank for that. Until just recently, I had no idea what had happened to Mr. Bradley. I had heard he quit teaching shortly after I graduated. He was a charming man with a northern accent, and hardly any of my classmates actually liked him. I never understood why. To me, he was like a cult leader. I hung on his every word. We were studying Macbeth, and Mr. Bradley was talking about symbolism. I still remember everything he said, to the point that I parroted half of it to my own students 8 years later when I taught Macbeth myself. I remember, for example, a moment when the weird sisters are gathered around a cauldron and casting a spell. Mr. Bradley here started talking about the image of the Ouroboros, the snake devouring itself, as a symbol of life and death, and the cycle between them. This became a tangent about the similar meaning of the wedding band, an eternal cycle of love between two people. He did this a lot. He went on tangents that linked literature to history, philosophy, politics, and modern life. He showed me that novels, poems, and plays were intrinsically and inescapably linked to the world around us. That stories were nothing complicated or unrelatable, rather that literature reflects life. He couldn't help but marvel at this himself and, in turn, instill that same fascination in me. After Macbeth came Lord of the Flies. And all of these crazy questions regarding religion, politics, and philosophy started flying about. I had no idea that books could be anything more than dull stories I didn't care about. As I mentioned earlier, until Mr. Bradley came along, I had thought of books only as movies without any of the engaging sensory parts. I couldn't understand how they could possibly be funny. But I trusted him. And when he told our class one day that The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was the funniest book he'd ever read, I believed him. I still didn't know how a book could be funny, not really, but I was eager to find out. The door into the world of literature, one that would change my life, had been opened. And so, as I and my classmates read Lord of the Flies with Mr. Bradley's words about Jack's alpha male tribalism and Simon being an allegory for Jesus bouncing around in my head, the image of Simon wearing a Jesus-like natural halo has been forever burned into my mind. Surrounded by a fringe of inquisitive bright creatures, itself a silver shape beneath the steadfast constellation, Simon's dead body moved out towards the open sea. I found myself utterly rapt. I built the island around me in my mind. I could smell the flowers, which were sweet, like tropical fruits. I could hear Piggy's annoying voice, which was nasal, tinged with a common Cockney twang. I could feel the sand between my toes, coarse, but heated by the equatorial sun. I was more lost in this world that was being narrated to me than I'd ever been in a video game, where I literally was the protagonist. How had this happened? I'd found a book that I understood and that understood me. I'd found a teacher to whom I could relate and whose enthusiasm I could feed off. If you grew up without books in your house as I did, it'll take time for you to understand what it is that so many people seem to value about a good novel. And that's fine. Every woman and man can learn to love reading at whatever age and in whatever way they feel like. It just takes a guiding hand and the right book. Even Mr. Bradley and Lord of the Flies didn't completely do it for me. It took a few more months for me to find myself in a chat with a few friends where I asked them to recommend me a more modern book, something with a bit more adventure to it. One mate said that he was a fan of Northern Lights, and that I should get on it quick because it's being made into a film soon. Well, I devoured that book and its sequels. I cried my eyes out at the end. I cried for hours. Today, I am an ex-high school English teacher and a relatively newly fledged freelance writer. I write about books for my own website. I met my partner at a job interview, where we both got lost in a chat about the stories of Neil Gaiman and how well Game of Thrones was adapting A Song of Ice and Fire at the time. Literature had led me into a wonderful life that I didn't even think I deserved. I read a study a few years ago, which talked about how reading good fiction increases your powers of empathy. Reading books from other people's perspectives, be it class differences, race, religion, nationality, can lessen your biases and allow you to appreciate other people in a way that reading the news or even traveling the world can't do. That's why my own work is all about translated fiction. But I first learned that truth about empathy for myself when I met Lyra in Northern Lights. I fell in love with her in almost the same way that I fell in love with my partner 8 years later. Good writing can change your very soul. Some kids grow up knowing that. Their parents and their teachers instilled it in them. That didn't happen to me. And it didn't happen to a lot of people. But that's okay. You learn it eventually, and when you do, it changes everything. I spent my childhood frowning at kids who got sucked into books, looking at them like they'd grown a second head. But once I was guided to the joys of reading for myself, I came to believe that a good book could end wars.